Welcome to this first event in our speaker series on ethics in tech, brought to you by the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy, a new research center whose mission is to foster research and analysis to ensure that new technologies are developed, implemented, and regulated in ways that are socially beneficial, equitable, and accountable, and by the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, an intersectional research community committed to reimagining technology, championing racial justice, and strengthening democracy through a mix of research, culture, and policy. My name is Michael Carr-Nicholas, and I am the Executive Director of the Institute for Technology, Law and Policy. On behalf of both institutes, I will begin by acknowledging UCLA's presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. This is, as I mentioned, the first event in our new speaker series. I am enormously excited for both of our guest speakers, so we will get right down to it. Cory Doctorow is a science fiction author, activist, journalist, and blogger, the editor of Pluralistic, and the author of young adult novels like Little Brother and Homeland, and novels for adults like Attack Surface and Walk Away, as well as nonfiction books like How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism. He is the former European director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and co-founded the UK Open Rights Group, born in Toronto, Canada represent. He now lives in Los Angeles. Dr. Sarah T. Roberts is an associate professor at the University of California, Los Angeles in the Department of Information Studies and holds an appointment in labor studies. She is a co-founder of both the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry and the Mindrew Initiative on Technology and Power. And she was recently appointed a research associate to the Oxford Internet Institute, as well as invited to join the editorial board of the Journal of Cyber Policy at Chatham House. She is a 2018 Carnegie Fellow and a 2018 recipient of the EFF Barlow Pioneer Award for her groundbreaking research on content moderation of social media. I will invite all of our audience to enter their questions or comments into the chat, which we will hopefully get to at the close of the event. And other than that, I'm going to try to stay out of this as much as possible and turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, Michael. Hello to all the many friends in the audience and others who have decided to spend a little time with us today. Hi to Cory, and thanks to everyone who made this possible. I'm thrilled to be here. I want to make a little correction because I'm very excited about it, which is to say that as of this fall, I will be joining the Department of Gender Studies at UCLA as my primary home, still affiliated with Information Studies and with Labor Studies as well, but just wanted to toot that gender studies horn a little bit as we kick it off. I'm really pleased to be here. I had some trepidation, to be honest with you, because the mandate of the conversation is quite vast. And then I thought about it, and I remembered another panel I was on with Cory, and we had no shortage of things to talk about, and I got pretty jazzed and excited. And as it so turns out, there are any number of kinds of situations and cases that I think kind of illustrate some of the concerns and themes that could be broadly painted with this ethics in tech brush, including what constitutes ethics in tech, who decides, how does that concept relate to longer philosophical traditions of the concept of ethics, of which I am not an expert, so I'm just going to name that right now. The relationship to law and policy, the relationship to other concepts that are often intertwined and probably bear some disambiguation, things like accountability, fairness, transparency, and other kinds of words that have gained prominence over the past handful of years. And then I guess the question of what are those things responding to? So why have those become prominent buzzwords or keywords for people who are concerned with the influence of primarily digital technology in everyday life? And so for me, I came to the table with those things kind of in my head, broadly speaking. Very specifically, I've been thinking a lot about the OnlyFans case that has been in the headlines over the past several days with a new twist as of today, as far as I understand. So I thought maybe we could share and discuss that as well. And then I'm just happy to spend a little time with all of you today. So thank you.
Outstanding. Sarah, do you want to kick us off with kind of your impressions of what just went on with OnlyFans? What was going on before? What happened yesterday when the CEO named the banks, and what happened today when they announced a policy change?
Sure. Yeah, I'll do my best to kind of summarize for folks who haven't been following this situation, but it seems like such an important sort of case in point for so many different reasons. It's really going to press on many people's own comfort level, I think, with some of these very issues that I tried to bring to the fore in my opening remarks. So what is OnlyFans? OnlyFans is an adult content site designed to allow fairly pedestrian amateur people the opportunity to create and share sexual content, which is monetized. How does it work? Typically by subscription. So a person might have, the idea is that they might have gained a following in some other social media platform, let's say Twitter, or maybe they have their own website, or they're prominent in some other way, and just put an asterisk on that for now. But typically what we're talking about is people who either were already working as sex workers, or upon becoming a content producer on OnlyFans, effectively moved into the realm of sex work. Not all sex work is illegal, but a lot of it is. A great portion of it is not. It tends to get lumped into kind of a rubric where there is a morality judgment placed on that kind of work. But I think, I'll just put my stake in the ground as saying that sex work is work, in my opinion. And this is a form of labor that many people engage in. And the legal ramifications vary. The idea on OnlyFans was that that people who either had a following or could create one would be able to monetize their sexually explicit content. That could have been something like provocative, but not necessarily sexually revealing imagery, all the way to people sharing images of and video of sexual content, basically pornographic content. But this was different from another site or kind of setup where the creators themselves were really at far remove from the economic processes that were being engaged on those sites. So if we think about other kinds of more traditional, if you will, outlets for adult content online, typically it hasn't been a situation where the people making the material would be directly compensated in quite that way. And so for many people, this was a sense of kind of circumventing that other model that devalued the people who participated in the content vis-a-vis those who controlled its circulation. And I guess I would add to the complexity of the situation the fact that many people were participating and giving their labor to this particular site, which of course takes a cut of these subscriptions and revenues generated on it, which is how it makes its money. Many people were going to this particular platform in the peculiar economic and social and political context in which we find ourselves right now, which is, seemingly endless pandemic, people out of work, people stuck at home, unable to maybe do the kinds of work that they typically would have done, or for whatever reason, coming to this site, which was having quite a bit of success. Okay, so all of that is the background. What happened? A number of days ago, it became known that there would be a vast change in what kind of content the site itself was going to allow. In other words, it was going to disallow completely any kind of sexual activity content, videos related to that. It would continue to allow provocative and even some nudity imagery, but it was really going to take a vast portion of what had created its success and deem it no longer allowed on the site. And let's just take as a given that this would be content that otherwise is legal in the United States. Okay, but it came down to an issue of the site's terms of service and the site really, having a perimeter around what was allowable and bringing that much more closely in. Why did they do this? Well, apparently, according to the owners and others who followed this, journalists and others, many people who worked on the site itself also were pursuing this because they saw this as a gross reduction in their potential to earn money. It turns out that payment processors such as the major credit card companies were being pressured by some groups, anti-pornography and other groups with certain agendas, to no longer process payments on these sites. Now, of course, these sites are completely dependent on electronic payment processing. And whether that's services like traditional Visa, MasterCard, or if that's things like Venmo, PayPal, Cash App, et cetera. And so effectively, although it didn't seem that OnlyFans itself was particularly perturbed about the content it was carrying, bookmark that, the banks, which were a portion of the infrastructure sort of out of sight and out of mind for the average person thinking about how the site operated, were they to pull the plug, there would be no way for money to flow anymore. And in a very unusual turn of events, and I think very much focused on the organization and the rapid response of the sex worker community itself, it looks as though, according to what I was just reading prior to joining the call, this decision has been reversed. And again, that was based on a lot of public pressure and questioning the motives of those who were seeking to shut this down, as well as sort of a kind of a slippery slope argument that I think resonated with many people. And so in some ways, this is a singular kind of case, but in other ways, this is a very typical kind of regime of contracts situation online where there is allowable behavior, allowable activity that exists under the law, but because these are private companies with their own stakeholders, let's put it that way, and their own goals and objectives around revenue generation, usually those rights tend to get abridged once one is on the site. And so in a way, it's a very typical story because although it may have been about more extreme content and a more marginal group of people who were ostensibly easier to target, I think they made a mistake there, but I think the thinking was there wouldn't be such pushback. I think many people were very concerned that the payment companies could exercise that much control and that in turn, they were being pressured themselves by sort of a shadowy faction whose motives were unclear. So I thought about that case when I came in today as one that we could potentially talk about, think about. We don't have to, but I thought it was very interesting in the context of the way that these notions of platform ethics, social mores, legal standards, et cetera, all kind of get thrown into a blender and, pureed, right? And they come out in this mix that's very difficult to disaggregate. So I'll leave it there.
I think that was an excellent summary of the recent events, and it made me think about the way in which this particular controversy surfaces a bunch of the difficult contradictions and cherished illusions about the internet. So, just on its face, there's this question of like why people in the sex industry use high technology, and there's been a pervasive story about this since the days of I think like probably Super 8 film, but certainly the Betamax, that there's something about the sex industry that makes it enthusiastic about technology. I think that's completely wrong. I think that people that using a new technology involves overcoming some transaction costs, like just figuring out how the projector works. And if what exists works for you, then why would you expend the energy to figure out how to use something new? And so what you actually find is that people who engage in disfavored forms of communication and who have disfavored ideology or disfavored uses for communications tools tend to be very enthusiastic about technology, right? So the reason kids, terrorists, and people who work in the sex industry are all looking for the latest and greatest new way to undertake transactions or use communications is because the system doesn't work for them, right? That by design, they're not supposed to be able to do what they want to do. But I think a much more chewy story or myth or contradiction that gets surfaced by the OnlyFans story is this question of contractual arrangement and its relationship to competition and to speech. So people on the right primarily have been making a pretty legally incoherent argument about the platforms being common carriers and having some kind of First Amendment duties not to censor or to censor in some even-handed way. And I think people who understand First Amendment jurisprudence are like, that's just silly, right? Like it's not even, as the physicists say, it's not even wrong, right? But there is a way in which it isn't entirely wrong, which is that if the thing that you're interested in, if the motivating principle of the First Amendment is to promote free expression, then lots of other things can have a communications policy. Lots of other kinds of policy can implicate your communications policy. You know, you can imagine a notional town. I actually wrote a little thought experiment with this. I'm going to post in the chat. You can imagine a notional town where there's a restaurant called the No Politics at the Dinner Table Cafe. And, you know, like if there are lots of restaurants in town, then the fact that they don't let you talk about politics while you're eating has no speech implications. But if, you know, the town council lets them raise a ton of private equity money and use predatory pricing and other tactics to force every other restaurant out of business and establish most favored nation status with all of the local food suppliers so that there are massive barriers to entry, and secures onerous regulatory conditions regarding food hygiene that only a restaurant with very deep pockets can afford and not someone who's entering the market. And then you just can't talk about politics while you're eating. Competition policy and zoning policy and health policy, they all have a communications policy, right? And so, you know, this raises this question about how we arrived at this juncture in which choices taken in a small handful of payment processors or a small handful of domain registrars or a small handful of major hosting providers or a small handful of anti-DOS cloud providers or any of these other choke points can represent a kind of broken link in the chain that you need for free expression. And, you know, it does suggest that while like smacking on CDA 230 is like looking for your car keys under the lamppost because you can't find them where you dropped them, that the people who are worried that Mark Zuckerberg has nominated himself social media czar for 3 billion people's lives have a point, right? And you know, I this morning I listened to the latest Tech Dirt podcast in which Mike Masnick, who hosts it, was talking with a couple of very eminent copyright scholars, notably Pam Samuelson, about primarily about the Oracle Google decision and its anti-competitive elements of trying to lock down APIs. And that got them talking about competition law and hipster antitrust. And Mike raised a point that I've heard him raise before, that there are all these people worried about antitrust, but they're not worried about the levers that are producing anti-competitive outcomes, like telecoms law, like copyright law and its extension over interoperability and so on. And I found myself simultaneously violently agreeing and violently disagreeing with Mike on this point. I violently agreed with him that these are absolutely vital, but I think that if you approach this with a legal mind instead of a political economy mind, that you can't understand the relationship that market concentration has to policy failures. And that to understand that, what you have to understand is that a sector of disorganized firms that are medium-sized and all of roughly the same amount of power is not merely advantageous because of whatever like notional benefits accrue to a competitive sector, more choice. There's limits to what more choice gets you. No one's going to solve the world's problems by letting you pick your car in 5 shades of blue, right? So it's not just about fetishizing choice, but a sector that is disorganized has lower marginal profits on average. So they don't, because they're competing with one another. So they don't have retained profits they can use for policy entrepreneurship. And then a sector that's disorganized has a giant collective action hurdle, right? If we were all in person today at UCLA and then wanted to pick a restaurant afterwards to go to lunch, the 103 of us would never be able to pick a restaurant, right? And if there are 103 companies in a sector, they're never going to be able to arrive at a single lobbying position. But, when a sector consists of a small enough group of people that they can all sit around a table, they usually do. And when they do, they can decide on what priorities they want, and they can enact policies that are parochial, right? That reflect their priorities and not their own. So I want to finish by pasting in a link to another article I wrote yesterday. That's a response to something in the Yale Law Journal by Temple Law's Erica Douglas about the intersection of antitrust and privacy. And she says, now that we're talking about antitrust, we have these privacy concerns, right? Like if you impose interoperability, then, bad actors might suck data out of big tech silos. If you're going to enhance competition, you might enhance competition in surveillance, right? Like making the ad tech sector more competitive might just mean that instead of just Google and Facebook having insight into literally everything we do, there might be hundreds of companies that get that kind of insight. And I think she's right, but I also think she's wrong. I think she's right to the extent that competition law can be pursued with competition as its own goal. And, there are real world contemporary examples of that happening. The Competitions and Markets Authority in the UK did this deep dive last summer into the Google Facebook ad tech monopoly and found that a critical factor in Google's monopoly dominance is that they can do this thing called attribution, where they show you an ad and then they follow you around the web and they follow you around in real space, and they get all of your transaction data to see whether you bought the thing that was in the ad. And the CMA goes, well, advertisers really like attribution. So all other things being equal, Google and Facebook are always going to have more business than the rest of them. We should democratize attribution by assigning every person in Britain their own permanent ad tech identifier so that more people can track them. And, if all you care about is competition, then yeah, that's where that leads you. And you will find yourself making all kinds of very bad choices. But if you think about competition as having the goal to promote what Ida Tarbell called legitimate greatness in her History of the Standard Oil Company, this muckraking book that brought down the Rockefeller empire in 1904. If it's about promoting legitimate greatness, Rockefeller's penchant for like organizing extremely efficient oil supply chains, and not illegitimate dominance, which she identified as like Rockefeller's capacity for dispatching tire iron wielding goons to beat in the brains of his competitors' workers, then it becomes easy to understand how we might use competition law to promote communications goals, to promote human rights, to promote other labor rights, and so on. We can support DoorDash when it says we don't want to share our data with other people in New York, as New York City has tried to order them to, because it's sensitive and privacy matters. And we can oppose DoorDash when they say we are not going to show Dashers how much money they're going to get for making a delivery because it might compromise our customers' privacy, because we can tell the difference between privacy and privacy washing if we have this lens. Back to you.
There's so much to pull apart in these thoughts. I jotted down a couple of things that I was thinking about of interest to me anyway. I was thinking about the kind of myth of the bleeding edge of the internet being sort of these outlier communities, let's say, or these outlaw communities to a certain extent. And I was thinking about what OnlyFans really is, and it's relative low techiness, right? There's not any, to my knowledge, any particularly new technological innovation in that platform. It's hasn't invented a new compression algorithm for video. It hasn't, done some kind of new thing in terms of recommendation algorithm that's really interesting or something. I don't think it's done particularly anything. It's a video sharing website, of which there are any number of them. So, it's about the content, and it's about the community of producers that makes it stand out. And, that leads us to a very different analysis in terms of what's wrong with it, right? And the quote in quotey fingers. The other thing I was thinking too, one of the other kind of notorious bad actors or sites or sources of worrisome things on the internet, the 4chans and the 8chans of the world, are about the simplest tech you can get, like old school threaded, HTML BBS forum. Pretty much nothing innovative about that. So it's really about the content. And that's really what the debate is over. And I think we can't lose, I think it's worth circling back on that and underscoring it to understand what the debate really is. It's also about, in the case of OnlyFans, whether or not a particular sector of society has the right to monetize itself. So, I guess it's okay if some third party produces pornography. Now, for the groups that were raging against the payment processors, it's not. But certainly there was a sense that this was an easy crowd to pick on, right? Again, it reminds me of when people go after librarians because they think they're like docile and shushers. I mean, it's like the worst crowd you can agitate. Really a mistake there. The other thing I was thinking about too with regard to this case is the fact that with the talk of and sort of the public and collective debate around monopoly power and how it gets exercised in the tech sector, what has been interesting to me about OnlyFans and a few other cases that if I were put on the spot to think of them, I could probably come up with a few others, but particularly OnlyFans shows that this issue of monopolistic dominance goes beyond the user interface level in the stack, right? So a lot of the concern around monopoly and its power has been around platforms and services like Facebook and its market dominance. But in fact, the target here, in a way, wasn't even OnlyFans. The target came at a different place in the stack, and that place is mostly invisible or not thought about by your average user of OnlyFans. In fact, I've been marveling recently at how easy transactions have become, even as compared to just a few years ago with the advent of things like Apple Pay, Shopify. I don't even have to enter in my own data anymore when I want to purchase something. It's always there and ready to go. And so the transaction, the financial transaction in which people engage on platforms is becoming even more invisible. And yet that infrastructural element is often dominated by a couple of players in the market who exercise incredible power. And if they were to rescind their participation, it would effectively shut a business down. And so it's not limited to the to this payment layer either. We might think about other vulnerability sites, things like Amazon Web Services, for example, on the one end, storage and cloud-based software providers. Or we might think about the pipes themselves. We might think about the undersea cables and who owns them, or the fiber that is that traverses a neighborhood or doesn't make it to some, right? And the providers in these areas are relatively small in number, and therefore very vulnerable, or make us very vulnerable when a case like this occurs. Okay, so Visa's out of the game. Go to MasterCard. MasterCard's out of the game. You're in the United States. Good luck with Discover, I guess, or something. Good luck with these other payment processors. And I'll just go one step further on this on kind of these alternative payment processors, again, like Venmo, Cash App, etc. They also have terms of service that are significantly more restrictive, let's say, more restrictive than you might expect. Again, I don't anticipate that most of you, although there's probably a lot of legal scholars on here, so I'll exempt you from this, but most of you probably haven't spent an extensive amount of time with your Venmo terms of service and so on. But that can be rescinded at any time. And a person who is in any kind of sex work, including legal sex work, can be very easily put on a no-go list and removed from a service like Venmo. And suddenly that person finds herself removed from all payment processing services. And suddenly that person tries to order a burrito on Caviar and is told that she can no longer have an account on Caviar for reasons unknown. She pursues it and finds out that they won't reveal why, but she's on some sort of list. This is not a made up story.
I have an aphorism that I call the shitty technology adoption curve, which is that, if you want to do something abusive with technology, first you do it to people whose complaints don't get an airing, and then you work your way up the privilege gradient. And so 20 years ago, if a CCTV was watching you eat your dinner, it was because you were in a supermax prison, and now it's because you bought an Apple Home system. And apropos this sense that account termination has become a really significant area of concern. Maybe the canaries in the coal mine there were sex workers, but now it's everybody. Because if you think about what it means, so we recently had someone contact us at EFF who said, well, I sell the odd thing on Amazon, or no, I buy things on Amazon. That was that. He wasn't even an Amazon seller. I buy things on Amazon. There was a problem with my credit card. I don't know what. They terminated my account. I had 15 years worth of family photos. I hosted my small business on Amazon Web Services, and I had hundreds of audiobooks that were locked to Amazon's DRM monopoly platform Audible, which is more than 90% of the trade audiobook market. And I lost all of them without appeal. And when I reach out to Amazon, all I get is these autoresponders that ask me to provide documents I've already provided, and I cannot actually communicate with anyone at Amazon. And I wrote a thing about it. I'll post another link to it in there. I just saw that I accidentally posted the link to the wrong group. Zoom's bad UI strikes again. So I'll post all those links in a minute. But I wrote a post about this, that if you think about what it would mean to lose your Google account, it could mean losing all of your email, including like the last message your father sent you before dying of COVID when you were both in lockdown, you couldn't see him. It might mean losing your cloud drive with the things that you need to survive an IRS audit that you've got coming up. It could mean losing your mobile phone and losing your mobile phone OS and being locked out of your device. It could mean losing all of your family photos. It could mean losing hundreds of hours of video and your business if you're a YouTuber, and all kinds of other things. And again, there's no due process. It's all treated like house rules. And the lazy answer to this is, well, let's just make Google into a government, right? Let's just see if we can't impose on Google the state-like duties that would turn it from a reckless king into a wise king. And while I'm all for making sure that Google behaves itself, I don't think that the answer to the problem with Google is that it's governed by people who are reckless. I think the problem with Google is that you cannot run a service that is that vertically integrated with that many users equitably. And so, we have lots of antitrust remedies in the toolbox. We have interoperability, we have breakups, we have merger scrutiny, we have all kinds of things. And all of those are likely to produce a better outcome as compared to, say, what the European Union did in 2019, where they said, well, Google actually does have a problem with copyright infringement and wage theft from creative workers and so on. We're going to impose a duty on all platforms to install copyright filters, which we know are really unreliable, but we also know are very expensive. Google spent $100 million so far on Content ID. That was as of 2019. It's probably larger now. And that only does this tiny slice of what the EU was contemplating at the time, which they eventually enacted. And all that does is guarantee the extinction of all of the people who might someday challenge Google. And if you think Google is high-handed and arbitrary when it has, a few competitors, imagine what it's going to be like when it has no competitors. This is what happened with AT&T, where like every decade or so they tried to rein it in, and every decade or so it said, well, why don't you punish me instead by making me part of the public safety apparatus? You give me a universal coverage mandate, and then that'll be what I do for my penance. And then the next time they abuse themselves, someone came along, they would say, well, but how can you break us up? We're the universal coverage entity. In the 50s, they tried to break them up, and the Pentagon came out and said, we won't be able to occupy Korea without AT&T. And it got a 30-year stay of execution as a result of this. So I think that, we're at this juncture now where we fix the internet or we fix the tech companies and their supply chain, including DDoS, payment, and so on. But we can't fix both, right? We can either make the internet pluralistic and diffuse decision-making into lots of hands whose boundaries are set by democratic law, or we can try and take the barons who've emerged and write a Magna Carta where the barons all agree to elect a monarch and to make sure that monarch behaves responsibly.
This particular point reminds me of why so many felt that Mark Zuckerberg's comments before Congress were so duplicitous, or let's say in a less aggressive way, let's just say at least favorable to his status quo around any kind of reform for Section 230, and this was related to content moderation more specifically, but broadly speaking, a lot of different things. And he was eager to say that he would, he was open to specific types of reforms and specific types of perhaps congressionally mandated processes or other kinds of things that would come from the government in terms of changing their operations. And Jack Dorsey of the much smaller Twitter was quick to point out that he wasn't against that in principle, but he thought that would absolutely kill anyone's ability to enter the marketplace subsequently, because they would not have the tech, they would not have the budget, they would not have the expertise or the access to any kind of infrastructure to do the things that Zuckerberg was willing to sign on to, knowing full well that they had those capacities at hand. And so, even these comments before Congress that are like, yes, no, you've got to read against the background relief of these disparities and of the way that the status quo in terms of access to resources, including engineers and their minds, put these companies so far ahead of anyone who would enter the marketplace. And you reminded me of a funny thing that happened to me once. I was trying to buy this board game, which just leave it, okay? Just leave that alone. I don't want to get into it, but I was trying to buy a board game. It's out of print, and it's called Cuba Libre, and it has to do with the Cuban Revolution in the early 60s. And I was, paying a private person who had a copy for sale, and I was, using PayPal, whatever. And the transaction was completely frozen for a period of months, during which I had to go through this, Brazil-like, process of uploading documents, proving that in fact this was a transaction involving a board game, and I wasn't supplying material to a group against the best interests of the United States. And so I just appeared in a simple word search. You know what I mean? That's how the transaction came up on like a keyword search, and it was hilarious. And the other thing, it's funny you bring up Kafka. this Kafka-esque situation. I was just thinking the other day, I don't know if you saw this, but Richard Dawkins was opining on Twitter about what's the point of Kafka and the Metamorphosis, and what a useless book. And if he were a scholar of this area of things, he wouldn't feel that way. So anyway,
yeah, maybe he's just trying to figure out how a cockroach might mutate into a human or something. It's literally biological, And
yeah.
since we're here to talk about the issues of human rights through an intersectional lens, it's important to note that these harms are not evenly distributed, right? That maybe the filter has an even chance of catching all people. Anyone who puts the terms Cuba Libre into their PayPal payment note has the same chance of being flagged by the dumb filter. But whether or not someone who can get you unstuck, or whether you have enough Twitter followers that when you tag PayPal, it gets escalated to someone who isn't an underpaid worker in the Pacific Rim who can only follow a script and not actually take initiative. That's how you get it. And so, this idea of access to civil justice is really important, especially in the context where you have nothing that looks like pro bono law, nothing that looks like legal aid, and really, when Larry Lessig says fair use is the right to hire a lawyer, the ... that comes after that is for people who can afford to hire a lawyer. Otherwise, it's nothing, right? And so that's the piece that we need to remember. And this isn't an argument against regulation, but it's an argument for regulation that takes into account the kinds of equities that you want to produce, right? That isn't just reflexive. So I've got a book coming out in 2022 from Prospect with Rebecca Giblin, who's a brilliant copyright scholar from Australia, called The Shakedown, about the limits of copyright as a means of preventing wage theft and exploitation within the creative labor markets. And it talks about all the different ways different intermediaries can impose themselves between creators and audiences, and investors and audience and creators, and skim off the top. And we say, like, look, you can't just give someone in a highly concentrated market more alienable rights like copyright. That's like giving your bullied kid more lunch money in the hopes that the bullies will go, oh well, your mom gave you $5 yesterday, gave you $10 today. We'll just take $5. We'll leave you $5 for lunch. The reality is, if you extend copyright scope, for example, we extended the scope of copyright to cover samples, as a kind of de facto matter. It had been dismissed as an unlicensed activity for many years of the early years of hip hop. One of the arguments at the time were that there are all these heritage acts who had absolutely unconscionable contracts. Right. That they had been advanced a lot of money when they got their contracts, but then all of that money was eaten up through funny accounting, where it was like, well, we're going to bill out the engineer that we told you had to use at some shocking amount of money. And so basically it didn't matter how many records you sold, you would never be in the black, you would never see another dime. And that advance payment was all you ever got. And they said, well, now we can get them some licensing revenue. And it was sort of true to a first approximation. But what you saw immediately after was that all sampling rights were then non-negotiably acquired as a condition of doing business with the record labels, who promptly concentrated down to 3 labels, who also took a significant stake in Spotify, and immediately set about doing things like negotiating lower royalty rates at Spotify. Because if you're Universal Music and you own a big chunk of Spotify, the royalties are monies that you have to split with your artists, but the profits are money that you return to your shareholders in dividends. And so Spotify is more profitable when it pays a lower royalty rate. And so you can negotiate a lower royalty rate, retain more earnings, and deliver them to your shareholders. So, we discuss things like market concentration, copyright reversion, labor rights, all of these other measures. It's not just that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But, when you've been smashing yourself in the face with your hammer because you think it's a nail for long enough, it becomes really hard to convince you to stop doing it.
So I wonder if we want to take up any questions or comments from the audience. Is that on the docket today, Michael?
I'm for it.
Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, you'd be very welcome to if folks either want to input into the chat, or if they want to raise their hand, that would be welcome as well. Or of course, I mean, this is fascinating, and I'm enjoying this very much. So you could also just keep going in the interim.
Yeah, there was something I wanted to say that now escapes me, but I was thinking back to this idea of the vertical integration and the way these platforms track people across their online activity, and the UK's kind of solution in one dimension to that issue. Obviously, if the more players in the marketplace, the less value such a thing would have, right? And it just seems like there's a problem with dimensionality in terms of solving for these problems, where it either doesn't resolve the actual issue at hand, or it actually worsens it. And that seems like a great example of pressing on one lever to resolve creates a massive problem in another related area of concern. And in this case, it was the privacy concern. Most people don't want to have I bet if we were to take a straw poll right now, most people would not want to be assigned a numerical value that would then allow them to be more easily tracked across the internet, right? Which also it brings to mind another problem of the state of the monopoly online anyway, in terms of how we think about how things used to be, which is that it's more and more difficult to use the internet as it stands today in this kind of fundamentally interconnected series of islands, where even though you think you're stepping onto a new one, you're like kind of leaving your traces, or you've got breadcrumbs following you everywhere you go. Oh, I'm sorry, cookie crumbs following you everywhere you go. But there's really such a lack of ability to kind of inhabit different selves, right, online. And not to be too nostalgic, but I think about some of the promise of the early social internet, and so much of it was allowing opportunities for exploration of self. That didn't always work out in a positive way. But for many people, that kind of like seeking of identity was predicated on the ability to be in a place online that was effectively isolated from another place, right? To be someone on Usenet who you weren't on a BBS, who you certainly weren't on your Moo because you played a lizard person or an orc or something, right? So like you could like move and explore these different identities, and joke notwithstanding, that really meant something in particular to LGBTQ people, other people who are interested in exploring identity in different ways. And there was an ability to do that where the stakes were lower. And I really think the idea of course, no one on this call really puts much stock in the idea of anonymity online, because that's just not a thing. But certainly, and even then it really wasn't. But there was certainly an opportunity to be disaggregated in these different spaces. And so one of the consequences of this kind of monopolistic tendency of these platforms to own every part of your interaction, to track every part of your interaction, means actually a much more limited experience in essence for a person online. And it seems to me, when I think about things that have been lost, that's one of them. I teach this work a lot, and I think about it a lot, which is the work of early scholars of the internet, like Jennifer Light, who's a communications scholar now at MIT, who really, many of my students find these things like quaint or hard to believe that we thought cyberspace could provide certain, in this case, significant dream spaces for thinking about new forms of feminism in the case of Jennifer Light. Like, why did we ever think that was possible? Well, under the current circumstance, it doesn't feel possible, does it? It feels like another site of control, surveillance, and governmental politics being exercised. But there was a time, believe it or not, when those things seemed possible. And maybe that ship has sailed. Maybe there isn't going to be a way to get back to that. But could something else be imagined to fill in the space?
We've got some interesting questions in the chat.
Yeah.
One is about whether increasing users' awareness would limit unilateral decision making by companies. That's from Alessia. I'm sorry if I get anyone's names wrong. I was explaining before, I got new computer glasses this week and I forgot to get a glare coat on them, so I can't wear them on a Zoom. Otherwise, my eyes are just two giant reflected monitors. So I'm wearing my non-computer glasses and trying to read the teeny weeny type that Zoom renders chats in.
I have computer glasses on now, so
very good. I turned 50 last month. So
middle age is real. Yeah,
age of computer glasses. And then Nick Levson wants to know if turning identities into brands inhibits exploration, that social media exploration you're talking about. And George Ruiz wants to know about approaches to spreading online disinformation or misinformation. Is it more, is it drowning out bad information with good, or is it putting limits on contents and groups? I have strong feelings about George's question, so maybe I could start there and then you could take one of the others. So I think that the problem of misinformation and disinformation is only secondarily a problem about what people believe and primarily a problem about how people believe, right? It's epistemological. In a technological complex society, you cannot do the research to know the answer to all the questions. Some people on this call probably have enough virology and public health chops to actually evaluate claims from the CDC. But I think most of us, if we were honest, would say, no, what we're doing is we're treating the regulatory process and the scientific process as a box. We don't understand what's in the box, but we can study the box itself. We can see if it's sturdy, right? Is it adjudicated by people who are neutral and disclaim any conflict of interest? Is there a basis for creating new information and inserting it into the process and reevaluating its conclusions and so on? And so I think that we've had lots of reason to believe that the box isn't very good. If you know why you trust the CDC on vaccines, and I trust the CDC on vaccines, I am fully vaccinated, but if you know why you trust the CDC on vaccines, but why you didn't trust them on opioids, or why you didn't trust the FDA on opioids, if you know why you trust your doctor when your doctor says you should get vaccinated, but shouldn't have trusted your doctor when your doctor said OxyContin isn't addictive, then you are able to resolve a conundrum that I can't. I mean, I've thought a lot about why I believe one and not the other. And what I've concluded is that it's just a bunch of priors. It has more to do with kind of my social identity than it does with my understanding of the subjects of either addiction or vaccines. And that's a kind of terrifying place to be in, because believing the wrong technical things can kill you 11 times a day, right? I drive a Kia. Last month they had a ransomware attack. I am trusting that Kia is not lying when they say it didn't impact my anti-lock brake system. I don't know, right? I'm trusting that the deliberations at Burbank City Code that produced the alloy specifications for the reinforced steel joist that keeps the ceiling over my head from falling on my head, that those were good deliberations. I'm not a metallurgist and I'm not a civil engineer. I don't know, right? I live next to Burbank Airport. I fly Southwest. They fly 737 Maxes. I'm trusting every time I get on one of those that the deliberations over remediation of safety issues in 737 Max were high quality deliberations and not the low quality deliberations that led to the approval of the old firmware for the 737 Max that killed hundreds of people. And so I think that the reason that people don't trust our institutions is our institutions are mostly treat truth seeking as an auction. I think that's an epiphenomenon of monopoly, that highly concentrated sectors are able to buy the truth rather than defend the truth. And that under those conditions, you just kind of are left on your own. You're like, find people who sound like they know what they're talking about and band together in the hopes that there's strength in numbers and that maybe the wisdom of the crowds will help you navigate really hard questions. Like, you know, I didn't believe anti-vaxxers when they said you should be arguing that your kid is safe to go to school last year. But I'm supposed to trust the Burbank Unified School District when they say it's safe for my kid to go to school this year, because one was the institution and the other one is a mob. Burbank Unified School District has made a lot of bad calls. I've only lived here 5 years. I could name 10 of them, right? They're also not epidemiologists. And so I think that we are looking for our keys under the lamppost when we try to figure out how to get people to stop believing bad things when they read them online, instead of, or stop people from seeing bad things online that they go on to believe, instead of making the good things more credible, which admittedly is a long journey that involves some deep structural changes. But, you know, wanting it badly isn't good enough. And if that's the case, then that's the case. And we just got to get started.
So I'm interested in Alessia's question too, that you hit upon, Cory, which is this question about increasing awareness on the part of users, and if that's a viable way to intercede on bad practices, bad decisions, bad information, etc. Absolutely, I think it is. I think, in fact, it's one of the few things that tends to really get agitation at firms, because ultimately the currency of the firms is to be able to have a large stable of a user base and to be able to consistently deliver that user base, and anything that might impact that, like just gross dissatisfaction among either those it relies on for content production or those it relies upon for consumption, those lines cross, but any impact on that really gets them stirred up. I do think that the OnlyFans case is interesting. It's interesting for many reasons, and obviously it's still breaking. So I'm just watching it unfold along with the rest of you. But it does have some unique features. One of the unique features that perhaps made it more, I don't know what word I want, more able to respond to that dissatisfaction, is the fact that despite it being, I guess, a veritable cornucopia of people's sexual proclivities and tastes, it's actually a very narrow kind of content delivery that it does, right? It's engaged in a very narrow sector, in a very particular marketplace, and it's not all things to all people. And in that sense, a response from a major portion of its consumers and participants, saying they're going to leave the platform, they're unhappy, there will be no reason for them to continue to use it, et cetera, has way greater impact than some subset of Facebook users or Twitter users. And so here again, we can see why more competition and more options in the marketplace would benefit users, because their will would carry more weight in these kinds of working out of calculus at the firms of whose needs they'll meet, right? And so I think something about that relative narrowness of the marketplace, the user base, and the producers in this case had an impact. The other thing that has an impact is really bad press, right? And those things are interrelated. And so there was a lot of bad press. I think also, to the point of canaries in the coal mine that came up earlier, again, this was a bit of a misstep on the part of the of the payment processors, aka banks. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm sort of loath to take morality lessons from credit card issuers. Like, that just isn't a crew that has a lot of moral authority in my world. They do a thing and they provide a service, and that's great, but I don't look to them as a moral compass particularly. because they typically haven't been in the business of making those discernments, at least discernments in the best interest of, from my perspective, the public. Okay, so I think it was a very unpalatable, powerful entity that was making a decision that very much targeted a group of marginalized people who are already subject to extensive surveillance and marginalization and other kinds of, untoward scrutiny in society, and that people this time weren't buying it. They could see that connection point between, you're picking on an easy target, but we can very quickly see how this could be reproduced in other arenas once we've become inured, or we buy, the rhetoric that this is about the children, for example. Now, I'm not here to do anything other than decry the proliferation and circulation of child sexual exploitation material on the internet. And it is a problem, but I can tell you that problem exists on cloud storage services. It exists on one-to-one or one-to-many messenger applications. It exists in fora and BBSs. It exists being circulated on removable media. So it's not a problem that's actually isolated to this community. And in fact, in many cases, some of these platforms that provide sexual content have a better apparatus to contend with it. So that argument also, I don't think, held water in this case. And it's, again, the jury's still out, like this is still breaking. And I think we have yet to see kind of the dust completely settle. But I think some of these, there was a certain amount of cynicism in going after this group of people. And I will also say that sex workers are pretty good at mutual aid and organizing and informing each other and pushing back, maybe in ways that previously they weren't as easily able to do. But I think they picked on the wrong group also. So I think all of those elements are at play, but it could be instructive in terms of the user base agitating against something it thinks is an inappropriate abridgment of their ability to use a particular service or platform, and that pressure is coming inappropriately from some other place, either in the stack or just in the social fabric.
And I would say that in addition, the outcome of Sesta Fosta, the first incursion into CDA 230, which was meant to be a narrowly tailored prohibition on sex trafficking communications online, but which became a charter for removing sex workers and also their advocates, and also sex workers who weren't engaged in sex work per se, but rather doing things like sharing bad date lists about who they shouldn't extend sex work services to for their own safety. That the kind of the record is in, right? That the child trafficking didn't change, the safety of sex workers did, and that the excuse got a lot thinner. There's a question. Sorry, go ahead.
Just real quick, someone asked me, I think it was not meant to be just a direct message, but someone asked me, but are not the credit card companies possibly aiding and abetting an illegal activity, I guess, in processing payment on OnlyFans? Well, I guess so, although I would anticipate that their business-to-business contractual obligation that they put on OnlyFans demands that OnlyFans do due diligence to ensure that illegal activity is intervened upon and removed from the platform. So there's relationships between the processor and the platform that we have to think about, these business-to-business relationships. And do you think that credit card companies aren't engaged in processing all sorts of illegal transactions in all sorts of sectors all the time? So why the panic over this particular sector? Well, because it's a moral panic, right?
Yeah, this is a sleight of hand we saw with Apple's decision to non-consensually install surveillance software on all iPhone owners' phones, right? In the name of finding and eliminating CSAM. And one of the arguments that's raised in support of it, or as a kind of a way to excuse Apple for its for culpability for doing this, is to say that there is potential liability to them arising from either like actual knowledge or constructive knowledge standards in liability law. And it's really important to look at how those constructive knowledge standards change, because they follow from normative changes, right? So like one of the arguments that came up in Grokster when it went to the Supreme Court was whether Grokster had constructive knowledge of file sharing issues because they'd been told that some people using P2P were infringing copyright. And the argument that was actually, I'm sorry, it was in the appellate court. And the argument Fred von Lohman made at the time was like, if you told Xerox that the photocopiers at least were sometimes being used to photocopy textbooks, would they have an obligation to take them back from all the university libraries? And I think that if it were the case that Xerox went into the university library with undercover agents three days a week to find out whether or not you were photocopying textbooks, and if they caught you, they took the photocopier away, then if Canon didn't, that there would be a pretty good argument from Wiley that Canon had constructive knowledge, because there's a kind of industry standard that you have to send Pinkertons in to find textbook photocopiers. And to the extent that we say, well, there is no constructive knowledge standard that requires that Apple examine every file on every device it sells you all the time to make sure you're not breaking CSAM laws today, there might be one tomorrow, and that's why Apple needs to do it. We create self-fulfilling prophecy, because then if Apple in fact does inspect every file on your hard drive, whether or not you're sharing it with someone else, whether or not you've consented to it or made, meaningful consent, as opposed to like clicking a thing that said, by clicking here, I agree that you're allowed to come over to my house and punch my grandmother and make long distance calls and eat all the food in the fridge and wear my underwear. But, actually like formed real meaningful consent. Then, someone will eventually argue that Google has constructive knowledge that there's CSAM on its Android devices, and that they too have the obligation to examine every file that we create in case it turns out to be something that they have a duty to prevent. How are we doing for time? Do we go to 1/2 or were we supposed to stop now? Does anyone know?
Sorry, we the invitation said till about 1:15.
Oh, okay.
But that's not a
so I think we have
Yep.
one more question then. Do you want to take it, Sarah, or shall I? It's the one about whether the kind of drive to being a brand online makes it harder for you to play identity games and be different people for different purposes.
Oh, I mean, assuredly. I also think that we've got now at least one generation firmly engaged in growing up their entire lives online, which often is going to preclude the ability to, meaningfully engage, change one's point of view, develop as a person, etc., without having like this total track record of that engagement. And there are some very interesting concepts of how to mitigate that issue and kind of give back, especially young people, the opportunity to be exploratory online without like kind of being beholden to it. But my colleague Safia Noble of the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry is working on that actively, and I will leave it there because that's for her to discuss. But she is in the crowd here today. So yeah, I think it's a particularly worrisome moment too when we think about how many of us have now by default invited our employers into our homes very firmly, right? Without much ability to put up barriers. I mean, how many of you are Zooming on a work issued computer right now from your home? That line has blurred, and I think the identity of that one inhabits online. First of all, I mean, I think your point is about kind of branding oneself, but I also think each one of these platforms has its own imposition of norms and kind of like cultural constructs and conventions that kind of put you into a certain self-expression mode. So like you do things on LinkedIn was the example. You behave in a certain way, present yourself in a certain way on LinkedIn that fits what is the expectation is on LinkedIn, and kind of coloring outside the box, I think would yield results that most people don't want. So yes, I think I think that's part of it too. There's where can you go and kind of be weird and exploratory online without that being tied back to your professional identity, and suddenly that is tied to your LinkedIn identity and all these things. It's hard to find those spaces anymore, right? So yeah. I would say that.
I would add, you said earlier that maybe we don't believe in anonymity online anymore. I don't know that I think that. I don't know if I agree. I think that maybe as the internet is constituted today, it might be hard to be anonymous, but that's not because of like the imperatives of the technology, right? Like no one came down off a mount with 2 stone tablets and said, Larry, Sergey, stop rotating your log files and start, mining them for actionable market intelligence, right? Like no one puts a gun to Zuck's head and makes him buy your transaction data or gather your location data. And this is an area where, I think that like technology and law interact potentially very beneficially. We can prohibit certain conduct. And certain conduct at scale is very hard to undertake. It's one thing. Yes, I could put a thing outside of my house that sniffed all the Bluetooth beacons that went by, right? But I can't put one every 5 yards through all of Burbank and follow you around. That's a thing that you need infrastructural permission for, permitting and lots of other things. And, if it turned out that people were doing that on a kind of wildcat basis, we could in fact demand Bluetooth standards be upgraded to have a higher degree of anonymity. Like I think that that between prohibitions on certain conduct on a normative basis, right? Like I believe in being private in my home, even if I don't close the curtains, because I think that people who look through telescopes through other people's bedroom windows are creeps, and most people don't do it. I don't think it's absolute, but I think it's, there's a high degree of confidence that you can have for that. So normative pressure works. I also believe in punishing people who violate that law, violate that norm with law. So legal norms change things too. And I also believe in curtains because technology can help at the same time. And I think that they can all work together. I think that's time. Is that time?
Yeah, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Lots of food for thought. So I very much appreciate both of you being here for that discussion, which I very much enjoyed. Before we go, I'll give a quick plug to our next event in this series, which will be September 22nd at the same time with Eva Galperin of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who will be discussing stalkerware. So please join us for that. Thanks again to our brilliant speakers and to all of you who came out, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.